to Venezuela. 4 killed, nearly 300 injured, 2 food trucks burned by Maduro thugs in clashes at the border. Vice President Pence heading down there to meet with opposition leader Guaido today. Listen to Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. Roll tape.
But no military force.
We've said every option's on the table. We're going to do the things that need to be done to make sure that the Venezuelan people's voice, that democracy reigns, and that there's a brighter future for the people of Venezuela.
All right. All options on the table. Important statement. This lady is Mary Anastasia O'Grady, Wall Street Journal expert on Venezuela. When are we going to do something when we see people shot in the street for protecting American food?
Okay, well, I want to back up for a minute. Let's just confirm that this weekend was very bad for the dictatorship, because all of these human rights violations that you saw very visible on camera have been going on for many years. This wasn't a deepening of the crisis. This was a revelation to the world. And one of the good things that the good guys have on their side is that we've been building a coalition, an international coalition. That's number one. Number two, it's not like we haven't been doing anything. The main thing that we can do with Maduro is cut off his resources. And the U.S. some weeks ago basically stopped buying oil or started diverting the payments for oil to the Guaido government. So you're asking a military question. And I would say that the Trump administration is right to say that all options are on the table. But I think it's very dangerous to think that you're going to march in there, defeat the Venezuelan military, and problem solved. Because what the Maduro regime and the Chavistas have done over all these years have armed a paramilitary. They have lots of Hezbollah, Iranians, ELN drug traffickers from Colombia. These are the guys that we would end up fighting if we ended up in some kind of an involvement there, and it would be an asymmetric war. I think we have to be careful about that and aware of that.
I understand that you don't necessarily want a military intervention by the United States. I understand how that could not necessarily work in America or Venezuela's thing. But how do we get him out? Is it just wait him out? Is that what it is? Because people are getting shot here.
Well, I mean, people have been being shot for years in Venezuela. So all we have now is that this has been elevated to the world stage. How do we get him out?
How do we get him out? If the rest of the world is coming onto our side and saying, come on, Guaido's the guy, how do we get Maduro?
You know, I like to think about the apartheid in South Africa. You know, that was done without firing a shot. But what happened there was morally the world said this cannot continue. Compare that to Cuba, for example, which, by the way, is running the show in Venezuela. What has gone on in the last 60 years in Cuba? There's been people applauding this tyrant Castro. So the fact that the world is kind of coming together with one voice, okay, I'm not including Russia, China, and Iran, but the civilized world is coming together with one voice to say that we oppose this. Then you start using financial pressure, cut off the water, cut off the food supply, cut off the electricity to this guy inside. And of course, the other thing, Stuart, is that we have to keep behind the scenes working, trying to convince the military, because one bit of evidence we have, I know you have to go, but one bit of evidence we have from this weekend is that the Cuban intelligence once again got wind of where the military was going to break and basically stopped them from doing that. That's what they've been doing for all these years.
I just want to know, is endgame a matter of weeks?
I don't think we can say that.
Could be months.
It could take a while, but I don't think, I think it's foolish to think that we're going to march in there and overthrow him. And
you're the expert, and I respect your opinion. I just wish that the end game was a matter of hours as opposed to months.
We have to keep coalition building. I think that's the international pressure is the most important aspect.
Mary Anastasia O'Grady, Wall Street Journal. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Right now, Vice President Mike Pence is in Colombia, meeting with Venezuela's opposition leader and interim president Juan Guaido. The two are discussing the United States' quote, unwavering support for democracy over dictatorship in Venezuela. The following a weekend of violent riots across Venezuela's borders because Venezuela's president Maduro and his regime has led the nation into a state of crisis. And now a massive shortage of food and aid in the country is leaving thousands of Venezuelans literally fighting for their lives. lives. Here's how the country got to the point that we're at right now. Back in 1998, Hugo Chavez was elected president after a decade in the 90s that saw a banking crisis, high inflation, and rising poverty. Chavez promised to fix the economy and revitalize the country's oil industry. The country's oil company had been nationalized back in 1976. Chavez exerted more control over it, however, giving the company exclusive rights to oil exploration and production. After a work stoppage caused production to plummet in 2002, production ramped back up, as you can see here, very quickly, bringing in billions of dollars. Now, Chavez used the money to pay for things like housing, education, health clinics, and more, artificially boosting the country's standard of living. He then died in 2013. Now, after appointing his deputy, Nicolas Maduro, as his successor, Nicolas Maduro hasn't gained the same cult of personality that Chavez had in his 14-year rule, but he has exerted more control as the Venezuelan economy has continued to collapse. It's a situation exacerbated by falling oil prices in recent years because the country is such a big oil producer and so much of its economy is dependent upon oil. Now the United States is putting its support behind this gentleman, 35-year-old head of the National Assembly, Juan Guaido, citing the Venezuelan Constitution's provision for when a president seizes power. But this decision is fraught because U.S. support for so-called regime change through revolutions or coups often ends in a political and economic condition that's worse than before the United States got involved. Joining me to talk about this now is David Ariosto. He is the author of This is Cuba, an American journalist under Castro's shadow. He also spent time in Venezuela back in 2014. And David, through the lens of history, I guess we have to ask, what does success look like in Venezuela, both from a Venezuelan perspective and from a U.S. perspective?
Well, from a U.S. perspective, at least from a Trump perspective, they want a quick ending to this. You know, the John Bolton of the world, the Mike Pompeos, they want a new transitional government in place under Juan Guaido, and they want it to happen quickly because these sanctions that have been put in place will start to affect the economy in a much more profound way, and there'll be real human suffering.
And that's hard to overstate because the economy is terrible. This is a country for poor people and working class people where inflation has been rampant. So it's about as bad an economy as it gets, and you're saying it could get worse.
Well, I spoke to one individual just the other day who said, you know, I have a salary of 18,000 bolivares, and an empanada costs 1,500.
Wow.
So when you look at that context, and that's already where inflation is, when the IMF predicts we're going to be looking at 10 million% inflation by the end of this year, I mean, this is just really an economy in a country that's just coming apart at the seams.
Okay, so the example we have of this in the world right now is Syria, right? A country in which the government collapses and then everybody else is in there because they've got interests. Venezuela is a country like that. The United States has interests, Russia has interests, Cuba has interests, and there's oil.
Yeah. Also, like Syria, I mean, if you look at Syria, you look at basically these two respective places, not only is this a bit of a proxy fight between, you know, U.S. forces and those in the region and the Russians and the Cubans and to some extent the Chinese in terms of their economic interests, but look at Assad. Assad never lost support of the military. Look at Mubarak in Egypt. He did. That's kind of what we're looking at here. As long as the military stays with Maduro, chances are he's going to weather this storm. And this past weekend he came out on top. I mean, you saw about 100 defections in terms of low-level kind of rank and file, but the core hard brass of this military has
senior level people. We've not seen major defections.
That's right. They're still in his corner.
But that would be the end for him if you saw senior level, because they're the ones guarding the borders. They're the ones who maintain the fact that there's no commercial airspace allowed.
You know, if you were to game this out, I would think that the United States and others are looking in terms of pressing in on these different areas by using some of these proxies or using opposition forces to sort of create these confrontations at the border. Now, if that created a kind of situation in which there were far more casualties, and we had a few die over the weekend and several hundred injured, but if those numbers were really ramped up and sort of major escalation, I think you might start to see the rank and file and those above them start to leave, because then these are their countrymen that they're firing on. And that really could spell the end of the Maduro administration.
Colombian officials told me they had more than 1 million refugees before this all started to go as badly as it did. From the perspective of a refugee crisis, a country where things are unaffordable and people are trying to get out, this, again, could mirror what Syria has been to Europe, Venezuela could be to the Western Hemisphere.
Yeah, I mean, again, the biggest difference between these two things is the lack of backlash that you've seen from the migrant crisis in Europe. You are starting to get some anecdotal reports, though, of some basic displeasure of the fact that there is such a deluge of humanity coming across the border to Brazil and to Colombia, and that there is really going to be a cost to bear economically in those countries to take on this leadership. Now, when you look at the region, and I think this is the important part, back in 2014, part of the reason that the Obama administration was actually able to make inroads, or was pressured to make inroads with the Cubans, is you had leftist-leaning governments across the region. Now you have Bolsonaro in Brazil, you have several other countries, pretty much every major country but Mexico is supporting Guaido. And so this international consensus, probably one of Trump's few international consensus in terms of foreign policy, is starting to bear out in a country where, the country is really coming apart at the seams.